and welcome to the Oak Spring podcast, where we celebrate the legacy of Mrs. Bunny Mellon through the work of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. I'm your host, Chris Stafford, and this is Season 2, Episode 6. And joining me this month, we're going to record the entire show on video, as well as being on the podcast itself, on any podcast app. We're going to be talking to Michael Donoghue, who's been a board member now for the last couple of years. Michael's an evolutionary biologist who's currently Sterling Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He's also research professor at Yale University. And he first joined Yale in 2000 as the G. Evelyn Hutchinson Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and over the past 20 years has served as chair of the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department, director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History, director of Yale's Marsh Botanical Garden, and director of the Yale University for Biospheric Studies. His research concerns the diversity and evolutionary history of plants and connections with phylogeny, biogeography, and ecology. Michael's been active in movements to reconstruct the tree of life and to link evolution to ecology and biodiversity conservation. And Michael has published over 300 scientific papers and 2 books and mentored over 50 postdoctoral associates and graduate students. Michael, welcome. And have I missed anything?
No, that's a pretty extensive list. Thank you. And it's great to be here.
Well, it's very nice to have you on the podcast and on the video, as I said, this month, so people can actually put a face to the names of the board members too. We love that. And first of all, thank you for all of your work that you do here for us at Oak Spring, Michael.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Well, let's start with a little bit of background, shall we? And I'm always curious as to how people come into these topics of, and become life specialists in a given topic. And it might seem when you started off, maybe in your youth, that is something that maybe you couldn't have made a career out of. But where's the catalyst for all this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up in a I guess you'd say an academic family. My father was an anthropologist. And when I was a kid, he was a specialist on Japan, and we lived in Japan when I was a little kid up until around 2nd grade. And then we moved to Vietnam for a couple of years where he was doing some work. And then eventually he landed at Michigan State University. And so our family moved back to Michigan, where I spent a number of years and graduated from high school. And in any case, all during that time, I had, as far as I could tell, in natural history. And my parents didn't encourage it, and they weren't particularly outdoorsy. They weren't particularly scientifically oriented. Although, as I say, my dad was an anthropologist, so I was surrounded by academic type people, but not scientists. Mm-hmm. And the only early connection was I had a beetle collection, I'm told, when I was a kid in Japan, and so that's about as close as I got to natural history. But then what happened is when I graduated from high school, I had no intention of going into science or academia or anything. I took a couple of years off and I traveled around. And during that time period, I got really interested in trees and natural history and that sort of thing, just traveling the country. And when I came back, I started taking a couple courses at Michigan State and ultimately ended up graduating from Michigan State with a bachelor's degree in botany. But what happened was I had a few lucky breaks. I got to know 2 professors who took me on field trips. And one of them was the first one was to the Smoky Mountains. And that's where I first really got hooked on plants and studying plants. And then another professor took me to Mexico for a summer, collecting plants in the alpine areas of Mexico. And so those 2 experiences kind of put me over the edge. And suddenly I realized, this is really what I want to do with my life. And then went from there to grad school and so forth. And I ended up at several different professorial jobs, San Diego, University of Arizona, Harvard, and then eventually ended up at Yale, as you said, in 2000. So that's a kind of synopsis of my background. I wasn't driven as a kid to be, interested in plants and animals or anything. It was a much later thing. It happened sort of in college, actually. So lucky for me.
I wondered if you were that little boy that would collect the bugs from the garden and keep them in a jar in your bedroom.
Yeah, well, for a little while. And that apparently, according to my mother, that ended badly when one day she found me eating some of the beetles. And she took me to the doctor and they said, no, it's fine. It's not going to kill him. So, but I didn't get into plants, and my parents weren't gardeners or anything else like that. So there was never a plant connection in our family. My brother, though, curiously turned out to be a mycologist. So he studies fungi. So the two of us, maybe as a kind of, counterpoint to my parents or whatever, or as a bit of rebellion, we both became scientifically interested in natural history.
Are you a gardener?
I have been, but now we're living. When we were living in Connecticut at Yale, I had a number of gardens there. But now we're living in Tucson, and it's so we're not doing vegetable gardening or anything of that type as we used to do. But we have a lot of outdoor play. We have a lot of. I mean, I'm into it. I'm into cacti and growing succulent plants and so forth, just as a hobby.
Did agriculture ever become an interest at all?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it really did. My mother eventually became a farmer herself. She grew up in Chicago. She had no knowledge of farms or anything, but she decided halfway through her life that she was really interested in farming and horses and that sort of thing. So she bought a little farm in Michigan and basically taught herself how to be a farmer. And I was a helper in all of that. And so I had a little experience with, running a farm and, driving a tractor and stuff. And then when I was first a college student, I thought my main thing was going to be agriculture. And I majored actually in soil science at first. And then, as I say, I got kind of hooked by botany at some point and shifted out of soil science and shifted out of agriculture altogether. But I have had a deep interest in that. And my mother eventually became, as I said, a farmer. She was kind of self-supporting for, part of her life as a sheep farmer. She got into sheep. So anyway, a little background.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you got down in the dirt yourself, actually enjoyed. It sounds like you did very much.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But my research has not involved a lot of, down in the dirt type of science. A lot of it is going on collecting trips and collecting plants all around the world. And then we bring them back to the lab, most as dried plants. And then we chop them up and get the DNA out of them, and then try to understand how the plants are related to one another based on their DNA sequences primarily. And so that's what my lab at Yale has been involved in for many years.
How did your interest in Viburnum become a specialism?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I don't know if I find this interesting. It had nothing to do with my choice of Viburnum as a plant to be to specialize on. Had nothing to do with anything very scientific at all. So it wasn't like I chose Viburnum because it seemed like it was a good scientific object of study. And in fact, the way it happened was, and there's a lesson in this, I think. And the way it happened was the professor who took me to Mexico, he said, well, I'll take you to Mexico, but I have one requirement. You have to do a little research and come up with a plant that you're interested in, particularly in Mexico. And then when we're down there, we're going to go out of our way to find that plant. But you have to kind of study up on it first. So I walked out of his office having no idea, like I'd never been to Mexico. I didn't know much about plants. But I walked out behind the building, and the first plant I ran into outside the building was a Viburnum. And I recognized that. And I ran back in and I said, does Viburnum grow in Mexico? He said, I think so. That could be your plant. And so we went down that summer. found viburnum in the field in Mexico. And then oddly enough, that ended up being the subject of my PhD dissertation, was viburnum in Mexico, basically, which was sort of a strange topic. But it wasn't like I chose it because I thought I could, that it was particularly interesting plant. It was just the first plant I ran into outside the building, so it was just chance, basically. But then, you make these things more interesting the more you study them, right?
Right. Yes.
So I found out a lot about viburnum, and I've been doing it, the rest of my life. Has been like 50 years of studying these plants, and I'm not the least bit tired of them. They're still my favorite plants, and I still love seeing every one of them. So it's been great.
What is it that triggers that spark in you then with viburnum?
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought I should do. So I've done a bunch of different things in my career scientifically, and so they're not all about viburnum. But I thought I should have some plant group that I know really well, like better than anybody, and just do a deep dive into these things and just learn everything about their biology that I could, and ecology and so forth. And the more you learn, the more interesting it is. Like I find people wonder, well, do you run out of questions after a while, or what? And that has never happened for even a millisecond. I keep finding new things about viburnum that I think are fascinating. And but the same is true of any group of plants. I mean, it could well have been roses or elm trees or something. It wouldn't have to be viburnum, but the more you study something, the more interesting it gets, I think. And you sort of start to uncover new stuff that nobody's ever seen before. And so there's an excitement in knowing something that nobody else knows, I guess.
Layers and layers of it.
Yeah, exactly. And the deeper you get, you just find all these marvelous things, and I've been shocked several times I thought I knew everything about viburnum, and then suddenly, oh my God, I didn't know about that, So it's been fun, but it's also been a great excuse to travel around the world because viburnums live all over the place. And so I've been, in the field collecting viburnums all over Asia, for example, all over South America, and it's just been a great adventure, the whole thing, and it's also great for me. It's kind of, it kind of relates to the story I just told you. It's been such a pleasure to take students with me into the field and, see their eyes light up about plants and whatnot. And, so going in the field and bringing students along and working with them and seeing their development has really kept me going through a pretty long career.
I was going to ask you about the travel involved as part of your research and going out, as you say, into fields all over the world, literally.
Yeah.
Have there been any surprises that have been actually fun surprises in these field trips? Oh,
it's hard to even single one of them out, but every field trip, there's some new discovery. And we've been going, for example, I mean, the last field trip I took was a couple of months ago, down to Oaxaca, Mexico, where I've been studying viburnum for years and years and years. And we found a couple of new things that I'd never seen before that will eventually be described as new species of viburnum. And this is after, I think my first trip down there was in 1973 or something like that. So it's been, it's 50 years later, and we're still discovering new things right in that small area, But probably the most exciting discoveries for me with viburnum have mostly been in places like Borneo, where I've found that there were some really oddball viburnums that nobody knew anything about. The flowers had never been described. The fruits had never been described. There was like some scrappy specimen in a museum somewhere, and nobody knew anything about them. And so we spent some months on several field trips going to Borneo, finding out discovering the flowers, discovering the fruit, just finding all this really basic stuff. But it was really exciting. It turns out that viburnum probably originated, maybe 60 million years ago or something like that, in Southeast Asia, and then moved around the world from there, moved into North America, then moved down to South America. And so, they've gotten around the globe, but they probably originated there in places like Borneo, which is kind of fascinating. And now Viburnum, I mean, I'm not sure how much you know about them, but they're widely cultivated, used in horticulture. They're big in the horticultural industry. But we mostly think of them as temperate plants that are adapted to cold climates. But it turns out that there's a handful of viburnums that are very tropical and live in really tropical rainforests. And those are the ones that nobody knew anything about. And so we've been able to shed some light on that.
So when you go back to these countries, then you said you've had many repeat visits to some of these areas. Do you go to the similar area then, Michael, or do you then move around and looking for new areas of where you're going to be able to do more research and further expand?
Yeah, it's a little of both. So we before we go on a field trip to a new place, we look up everything we can find out from herbarium specimens and such to find out where we could find some of these things. But then once we're in the right zone, then we can sort of say, okay, this is the kind of right environment where these viburnums live. Let's find those environments around here in other places. And so then we're off on a kind of exploratory phase, trying to find new populations of these plants. Once you get a kind of a bead on where they're growing, you can start to branch out from there. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. It's the thrill of discovery, really. Just like let's find these things. And I've had so many experiences of finding a new species of viburnum or an old species that nobody's seen for a long time. And sort of rediscovering these things, and it's just a blast, really. And we, some of this stuff is of horticultural interest. But a lot of my studies have mainly been to try to figure out the whole evolutionary history. How have these plants diversified? How have they spread around the world? Like from Asia to North America and so forth. And and that leads into a lot of very general questions. I mean, all of this sounds very specific, and it is. But we start to shed light on really big issues, big evolutionary issues, and for example, how have plants responded to climate change over many millions of years? We're able to trace that pretty nicely in Viburnum now. How they've moved in response to climate changing. So, and obviously that's of very general interest these days.
Certainly is an ongoing one.
Yeah.
I'm curious how the path to Oak Spring began for you.
Yeah. So Peter Crane, who is the director of the Oak Spring Garden. I guess, do we call him the president? I'm not sure if
I believe president.
Okay,
yes.
Anyway, Peter is I've known Peter for a long time. When I was a grad student, he came to interview for a job this was at Harvard, and that would have been in around 1980 or 81 or 82, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so I met him then, and we were actually very interested in similar topics. And so we got to be friends, and in some ways almost competitors scientifically. And, he studies fossil plants and primarily, and he's been interested all his career in the origin of flowering plants. When did that happen? Where did it happen? What did the first ones look like? And I was interested in the same thing, but from a different perspective. I was studying kind of modern plants and looking at DNA and stuff. And Peter was studying them from fossil standpoint. So our interests very much overlapped. And so I followed his career really closely. And of course, he's an amazing scientist and amazing, fantastic administrator as well, who's run a bunch of different programs. And he was the director of Kew Gardens and outside of London. He was the dean of the forestry school at Yale, which is where we overlapped also. Anyway, so at some point when Peter was getting going on expanding the board for Oak Spring Garden, we chatted about it, and then I joined. The other one who I knew on the board already, was Dorothy Robinson. And Dorothy was the general counsel, as a matter of fact, at Yale when I was there. And we overlapped on several projects when I was at Yale. So I knew the two of them. And so I think they felt comfortable, asking me to join the board. And it's been great. I mean, I love it. The board gets together twice a year for sort of in-person meetings, and then has one meeting that's a Zoom meeting in the winter. But it's been delightful, and all the board members are great. And we've found out so much about what's going on at Oak Spring, and it's remarkable what's going on. Tremendous stuff.
Well, we've got to know that you have another passion apart from Viburnum, and that is bluegrass music.
Yeah, so it's true. Well, it's sort of true and sort of not. Let me modify that. So, when I was a kid, my brother and I are both musically oriented, and we played in some bands when we were, and we played instruments like guitars and things like that when we were in high school and so forth. And then at some point I started working at a music shop, and I heard people playing the banjo, and I thought, oh, wow, that's a great instrument. I got to learn something about that. So I got a banjo, and I taught myself how to play it. So I've been a banjo player for, also for about, 50 years or more. And, but the qualification in this is that the type of music isn't exactly bluegrass. So when we think of banjos and fiddles and stuff, we tend to think of bluegrass music, and because that's more popular. It's kind of, it's a well-known type of music, and people can relate to it. It's got beautiful instrumentation, usually, a fiddle and a banjo and a guitar and a bass, and very slick in a way singing, with nice harmonies and everything. So the kind of music that I got interested in was sort of the primitive version of that, if you will. And we call it old time string band music. So it's in a way, it's the precursor of bluegrass. So, and one of the main distinctions between the two is the way the banjo player plays. So in bluegrass style, it's called you play with your thumb and two fingers. So you're sort of moving your fingers up. The thumb is going down. These other two fingers are coming up. So that's how you play it, and it gives a very distinctive sound. But the kind that I play, it's called clawhammer banjo. You may have heard of it, and you play it with this hand in a very different way. You're just hitting with your finger and your thumb, and all of the motions are down. There's not any up motion. And so it gives a very different kind of rhythmic sound, I guess you'd say. And so when you hear a bluegrass band, it's very slick banjo playing with lots of notes. When you hear an old time string band, the banjo player is playing this other style, and it's very rhythmic and not very melodic in a way. And so that's a subtle distinction, perhaps. But old time string band music is associated with the Appalachian Mountains. And that's where it grew up. It's sort of, you think of it as kind of like hillbilly music or something of that type, right? But anyway, it's a sort of a blend of African influences, Irish influences, Scottish influences, and so forth. And then you get this old time string band music, and then that evolves in a way into bluegrass music later on. And there's some very famous bluegrass names that you will know, like Bill Monroe or let's see, Earl Scruggs was the famous banjo player. Yeah. Right. So the old time music evolved into this kind of slicker version, which we call bluegrass. But I'm still stuck in this in the old time string band music, and I love it because as I said earlier, my first connection to botany was in the Smoky Mountains, and I got really interested in the Appalachian culture, everything about it, and Appalachian music. And of course, that fits beautifully with Oak Spring Garden, because Oak Spring Garden is situated right in the foothills of the Appalachians, the Blue Ridge and all of that, and on the Piedmont and everything. It's very Appalachian sort of centered place in a way.
I was coming to that then how you've come full circle, and you've brought that to Oak Spring with the music residency, and you conducted that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was great. So, when I joined the board, I realized, oh my gosh, there's all this really wonderful stuff going on at the garden, including all these artists that are hanging around. And there's these artist residencies for, visual artists and sculptors and so forth. But there wasn't much of a music component to that. Occasionally there'd be somebody who came to Oak Spring who was a musician, but it wasn't a particularly oriented residency. So in talking to Peter and Danielle Edie, who runs the programs and runs the art residencies, we just started chatting about, hey, maybe we could do a music residency and have it oriented around sort of Appalachian music, at least initially, just to get something going at Oak Spring along these lines. And so we said, well, we could start that by doing just a trial run by having me and some of my friends come down and play for a week. And so we did. And it was in June of 24. And we had such a good time and we made such good music, I thought. And it was me and a fiddle player named Justine, a guitar player named David, and a bass player named Paul. And we came from different parts of the country, but we know each other. And we played music and we recorded a number of things. At Oak Spring Garden, there's a lot of really great buildings and the sound. So we went around and checked the sound in different buildings for this kind of music. And we ended up recording things in what's called the granary, which is on the Rokeby side of the campus. And so we had a kind of a crude setup for recording things with just a few microphones, but we ended up recording a bunch of stuff and all of it original stuff that we were making up, And anyway, it was a blast. And I think you can access that stuff through the Oak Spring web pages now. If you go to the music residency, I think you can access those recordings there.
osgf.org. And the future then, what lies ahead for the Oak Spring Band?
Yeah, so what happened was then we said, okay, that was a lot of fun. And we played a few little concerts while we were there. There was one open day and people came wandering by and we were playing and it was, I think people enjoyed it. So we thought, well, maybe we can orient a music residency around some of the community days so that when the community was invited to come to the garden, in the next one would be in September, the band would be there. The music residents would be there and they would have been practicing and so forth. And then they could put on a concert for the community open day. So that's what's happening. We had a call for applications. We were delighted. There were like some really great applicants. And we had a committee and we chose one particular band to play in September. And they're called Bramblefoot. And they're from Tennessee primarily. And they're going to come. They're going to be staying on the grounds for like 5 days in one of the houses. And then they're going to play a concert on the open day in September. And it's just going to be great. But we were delighted because we had not only that band, which was fantastic, but we had two others. We had a number of others that were great, but we had two others in particular that we thought, oh, we should sign them up too, So one of them is going to come, I believe, in February to do a music residency, another one. And we have another one set for next June already. So we've had a great success, I was just stunned because, how do you get the word around about such a thing, through the web pages, but it's mostly word of mouth at this stage. But we ended up with really wonderful applications and we anticipate that'll happen now. Every year we'll try to arrange something like this. And I'm very excited about it. And I think it's going to work well with Oak Spring, to have this, the musicians will interact with the artists,
yes,
and with the entire community, the biocultural farm and of course, Jason who's the chef is providing some meals for the community. And it's just going to be tremendous, so very special.
With that kind of response then, Michael, what do you envisage for the future of the music residency program? Because the possibilities are endless, I would think, across music.
Yeah, they really are. I think we'll start we'll start for the next couple of years sort of emphasizing this kind of Appalachian-based music, which could be bluegrass or it could be old-time string band music, or something else. I mean, we're not very specific about this, but the idea is let's bring in some people who play this kind of Appalachian kind of music to get things started. But then I can imagine this expanding in a bunch of different directions. Different kind of music and doing it multiple times a year around different events. I mean, I kind of like the idea, the garden isn't open to the public very frequently, but occasionally, there's a day or two where people are coming. And I like the idea of, highlighting some of the music that's been produced on the grounds there. And also leaving behind, I'm really hopeful that we'll actually set up a little studio on the grounds. So that people can come and do some significant recording. And then there'll be just like the visual artists are, some of them leaving behind some of their work, then the musical artists, the musicians can leave behind some of their stuff in the form of recordings. And I just love that. I have a kind of like a historical, every year some beautiful music coming out of Oak Spring. So, and I can imagine it doesn't have to be in the long run. It might be different kind of music. It could be maybe some kinds of jazz, maybe so it's a classical music. You never know where this could go. But I think it was nice to start it with a kind of a bit of a focus.
And not to embarrass anyone, but I know there's a lot of other talent on the board, musical talent as well as other talents. But definitely there is musical talent there that's right now it's hidden.
Yeah. Well, sure. Dorothy Robinson, who we mentioned earlier, is a piano player who's really into jazz and stuff. And I know several of the other people are very interested in this kind of stuff. I think I might be the only banjo player.
Well, that role is yours then, Michael. Is there anything else that you would like to add about Oak Spring and your contribution and your ongoing interests and hopes?
Well, I mean, it's a gem, I mean, it's just a beautiful spot. And of course, Peter and the entire Oak Spring team are doing such a marvelous job, right? I mean, and they're constantly finding new things to do, I'm really excited about the conservation efforts, the biodiversity conservation. I hope I can play a role there a little bit, advising on that. I'm really excited about the biocultural farm and all the food that's being produced there. I mean, these are great things that the team has come up with. And the other thing I'm just really, I have to tell you, I'm very excited about this. The plan is to build an arboretum, on the Rokeby side of Oak Spring Garden. And of course, that's underway. And, trees are being planted as we speak, right? And it's really going to be cool. And it's going to take up a decent chunk of real estate, but it's going to be a great arboretum. Also, they have a project, you may not know about this thing about white oaks, where they're growing hundreds of white oak plants on the grounds to see which ones are resistant to climate change and to drought in particular. Isn't that interesting? And
interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And anyway, I was looking at that one day and I thought, well, if you're growing a bunch of genotypes of white oaks, that gives me an idea. Why don't we grow a bunch of genotypes of Viburnum on the grounds? And so I happen to have like 100 plants that we had collected around the eastern United States of a particular species, Viburnum dentatum. And I talked to Peter and Rachel and Cliff and others on the team, and they thought, yeah, we could put that in with oaks. We'll put, there's this section with all the oaks are growing there, little oak plants. Why don't we have another section with Viburnum? So it's the same basic concept of looking for which ones are resistant to climate change, which ones can do better in drought. Let's identify genotypes that are going to be resilient. And so anyway, we did this. We brought down a bunch of plants. We planted them. We now have, I think, about 90 Viburnums growing alongside the oaks. And I'm just thrilled by it, And so that's another sort of engagement. But there's just so many aspects of that Oak Spring operation that I resonate with, and that I hope I can be helpful, But they don't need much help. They're doing fine. But it's really been a blast to learn about it. and to try to think, where could I be useful to it? Been great.
Well, Michael, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure
for being on the show this month. It's been interesting to get to know you a little bit more.
It's great.
And we look forward to seeing you back here. And as Michael mentioned, Jason, our resident chef, he was also very busy with our recent annual Feast in the Field dinner that we hosted again here. That's a farm to table celebration to celebrate our farm season and raise funds both for our local education and outreach programs. That was a recent event here at Oak Spring. And Michael also mentioned the times when the gardens are open. Well, the next open dates for our tours are the 27th and the 28th of June, coming up very soon here. So go to the website, osgf.org, and you'll find more information about that. And you can also subscribe to the newsletter, the Oak Spring newsletter, on the website. You can also find us by email at program@osgf.org and on Instagram at Oak Spring Garden Foundation, as well as on X at Oak_Spring. And we're also, of course, on Facebook at Oak Spring Garden Foundation. Lots of ways to find us here at Oak Spring, and a lot more happening, as Michael said, and lots of new developments here at Oak Spring. So I hope you'll join us again next month for our next episode of the Oak Spring podcast. And meanwhile, share this with a friend and anyone you think might be interested in the podcast and find out more about Oak Spring. As always, all that information about the residences, the courses, the programs here at Oak Spring on the website at osgf.org. Again, my thanks to our guest this month, Michael Donoghue, for joining us, and to you for listening. Michael, lovely to see you, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a real pleasure. Appreciate it.